Today I want to tell a story of endurance, buried wounds, and a love that had no right to exist yet refused to vanish. It begins in the Arizona Territory, where the land stretched wide and unforgiving, a place so cruel that even the strongest souls often bent beneath its weight. The morning sky hung dull and gray, the color of cold ash, while dust drifted between the rocks like ghostly smoke driven by a wind sharp enough to cut bare skin. This was not a forgiving land. It was ground that remembered every drop of blood ever soaked into it. And into that harsh country rode a woman named Ione Whitlock. She was 36 years old. Though her body still carried traces of strength, her spirit was worn thin by years of disappointment. She had once been a wife, then a widow. Once faithful, then a runaway from a convent that demanded silence where she had needed a voice. She had been taught to obey, to endure, to be thankful. Yet life had given her nothing in return but bruises, cold stone floors, and promises that rang hollow. She traveled light now. A mule named Cinder, long past its prime, a skinning knife polished smooth from years of hard use, and a flintlock pistol that misfired more often than it obeyed. Her boots were split at the heels, her coat too thin for the bite of winter mornings. She had not come to this canyon to build a future. Truth be told, she had not come to live at all. 2 days earlier, Ione had stood at the edge of a bluff. She had stared down at the rocks below, wondering if the silence of the fall might be kinder than the silence she carried inside. Something had stopped her. She told herself it was fear, maybe. Or maybe it was the faintest strand of hope that somewhere in this brutal land she might still find a reason to breathe. That morning, as she guided Cinder along a narrow trail carved between stone walls, she felt the same quiet pull. Something about the dawn felt final, heavy. The kind of air that carried echoes of the dead. The mule snorted, ears flicking toward the wind, and refused to move. Ione let out a tired breath and slid down from the saddle. She took the reins and led him forward, telling herself it was nothing. Just nerves. Just the desert playing tricks on her mind. Then she saw it. A dark stain in the dirt. Thick, unnatural, like ink spilled across the sand. She crouched and brushed it with her fingers, nodding. Ink. Blood. Fresh though no longer flowing. The trail curved downward, slipping into a ravine below. Someone had passed through here. Someone was dying slowly. Ione's breath caught. She told herself it was none of her concern. Whoever had bled here was likely already dead or worse, dangerous. The Apache were known to range this far south, and a wounded man could be more deadly than any wild beast. Yet she could not turn away. She followed the trail. The descent was steep. Stones shifted under her boots. Every step was a choice between sense and madness. Every step reminded her she could still turn back. She didn't. At the bottom, beneath a twisted juniper, she found him. A man lay crumpled against the roots, half buried in dust and dry needles. One leg was swollen and bent at a wrong angle. Blood darkened the hide at his side, soaked deep into the torn leather. Fever had drained the color from his skin, leaving him pale and drawn. His lips were split. His chest rose in shallow, uneven breaths, barely clinging to rhythm. She knew what he was. The markings on his wrist wraps. The beaded braid at his shoulder. Apache. A warrior. The kind her world had taught her to fear. Ione froze. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, to turn away, to let the desert finish what it had started. But she didn't move. She watched as his eyelids trembled. For a fleeting moment, his eyes opened, dark, steady walnut brown, clear, despite the fever burning through him. They did not beg. They did not plead. They only looked at her. Ione's heart slammed against her ribs. She could have walked away. She almost did. But something inside her refused. She whispered, though she didn't know why. "Can you hear me?" He didn't answer. Maybe he couldn't. She lowered herself beside him and knelt in the dust. She pressed 2 fingers against his wrist and waited. There was a pulse, thin, unsteady, but it was there. His hand jerked faintly beneath her touch, and Ione Whitlock's throat tightened. "You're not dying out here," she said under her breath, more to steady herself than to reach him. She pushed to her feet and scrambled back up the slope, lungs burning. Gravel slid beneath her boots. At the top, Cinder balked again, planting his hooves. Ione yanked the reins hard. "Come on! Damn it!" she hissed. "Just once, be useful." She gathered what little she had, ripped her blanket clean in half, lashed the torn cloth between 2 sticks with shaking hands. Then she dragged it back down into the ravine. With a grunt and a sharp curse, she rolled the wounded man onto it. His weight pulled at her arms as she began the climb. Slow, relentless, inch by inch. By the time she reached the canyon rim, the sun was beating down without mercy. Her shoulders quaked. Her back screamed. She did not stop. She had made a choice. And once Ione Whitlock chose, she saw it through. At last, Cinder took the weight swaying beneath the burden. Ione walked beside him, breath heavy, murmuring half-formed prayers she no longer trusted. With every step, doubt gnawed at her. Why had she done this? Why had she saved him, this man, her people called an enemy? Why give him the chance at life she herself had nearly thrown away? She had no answer, only that he had been left to die. And something inside her, mercy, madness, or both, had refused to allow it. That was how their story began. By the time they reached the rim again, her arms shook violently. Sweat burned her eyes. Dust coated her throat. Still she dragged him forward. Cinder brayed in protest, but carried the load, as if he too sensed the urgency pressing down on them both. They reached an old storage hut, 4 crooked walls barely holding together. The roof sagged under years of neglect. Ione nearly collapsed at the doorway. She looked down at the man she had hauled from death. His breathing rasped shallowly. His chest barely lifted, the hide tunic clinging to him. His left leg twisted at a sick angle, swollen and misshapen. The dark stain at his side told her what she already knew. He was dying. He was Apache, a warrior, a man she had been raised to fear, to despise. Her father called her Whitlock, had cursed their name at the forge. Neighbors had called them devils. Soldiers she once fed from her own kitchen spoke of Apache raids with fire in their eyes. Every story she'd heard marked this man as her enemy. Yet here he lay, not raiding, not killing, not some painted terror in the night. Just a broken body, left alone. Her chest tightened. What right did she have to feel pity? He might have killed men she knew, burned homes, left widows behind him. Helping him could mean death if soldiers or bounty hunters discovered her sheltering him. But none of that mattered as she looked down. All she saw was a man abandoned to die. Something deeper than reason would not allow it. She knelt beside him. Heat radiated from his skin. Fever burned beneath her fingers. His lips were split, whispering words she could not understand, words without threat, only delirium. Ione lifted her canteen and tipped it gently to his mouth. He coughed, sputtered, then swallowed a few drops. "Stay still," she whispered, unsure if he heard. "Don't try anything. I've killed men before, but I don't want to kill you." His eyelids fluttered. For a brief moment his eyes opened, dark as walnut wood, and then they closed again. His gaze lingered on her face, steady, dulled by pain, as if he were measuring something unseen. Then his eyes slipped shut again. Ione Whitlock did not hesitate. Though her hands shook, she moved fast. She rolled him onto a straw pallet, tore strips from her petticoat, and pressed them firm against the bleeding wound. The bullet had passed clean through, but the flesh around it was swollen, angry. Infection had already taken hold. She set water to boil in a dented kettle, heated her knife in the coals until the blade glowed red. Then she pressed it into the wound. The flesh sizzled. His body jerked violently, pain tearing through him, yet he made no sound. His jaw clenched hard. Then mercifully, he went limp again. The stench of burned flesh turned her stomach. Still she forced herself to continue. She packed the wound with salt and pine ash, rough remedies learned from Ione Whitlock's old field cures, and bound it tight. Only when it was done did she sink back against the wall. Her hands were raw. Her whole body trembled. Breath tore in and out of her chest. Tears burned her eyes. But she had done it. She had kept him alive, at least for now. Night crept in cold and sharp. Coyotes cried across the flats, their voices slicing through the dark. Ione sat with her pistol resting in her lap, watching the warrior breathe. She did not know his name. She did not know who had shot him. She did not know what sins he carried. She did not know whether he would wake and thank her, or kill her. But she knew this: she had not turned away, and that choice bound her as firmly as any vow she had ever spoken. When dawn slipped through the slats of the shack, frost clung to the glass like fine lace. Ione stirred stiff and aching from the hard boards. She reached out and touched his forehead. Burning. Fever raged beneath her fingers. He muttered in a tongue she did not understand, his body shaking as if wrestling demons. Only he could see. She whispered a broken prayer, one she barely believed anymore. "Don't die," she murmured. "Not after I dragged you up that damn hill." Hours passed. She spooned water between his lips, wiped sweat from his face, and read aloud from the worn book of Psalms she carried more from habit than faith. Her voice was rough, unused to the prayer, but it filled the silence. She did not know if he heard. By the second morning the fever worsened. Ione sat with her back to the wall, knife glowing red once more in the coals. She bit down on cloth and pressed the blade again to the inflamed wound. She prayed he would endure the pain. His eyes flew open, wild burning locking onto hers. For a heartbeat she saw the warrior he had once been, fierce, unyielding. But he did not resist. He grunted once, then fell unconscious again. She seared both edges, poured boiling water over the broken leg, and packed it once more with ash and salt. Then she collapsed. Her palms were torn raw, her breath ragged. Tears streamed unchecked. She had not worked this hard since Calder Whitlock's accident years before, when an ox cart crushed his arm and she alone had stopped the bleeding. Back then, he had cursed her for it. This man, the stranger, said nothing. He simply lived. Days blurred into nights. Ione fed the fire, spooned broth and water between his lips, listened to the rasp of his breathing. Sometimes he murmured words in his own tongue. Sometimes there was only silence. Sometimes she dreamed of the convent cold stone-sharp voices calling her stubborn, ungrateful. And every time she woke, she found herself still beside him. She kept him anchored to the living world through sheer unbending will. And on the fourth morning, when his eyes opened and did not drift shut again, Ione Whitlock understood that her choice had bound her to something larger than herself. She had found a man already slipping toward death. She had chosen to pull him back, and whatever followed his life was now tangled with hers. The days melted together inside the battered hut. Time was no longer marked by hours or dates, but by the uneven rise and fall of a wounded man's breath. Ione's world narrowed to the place where he lay, to the fire she kept alive with scavenged branches, to the endless battle against fever and infection. Every hour demanded something from her: water pressed carefully to cracked lips, strips of cloth torn from her own clothing, ash and salt forced into wounds that refused to heal. The air inside the hut stung with the sharp scent of boiled water, pine smoke, and the faint, sour trace of blood. Her hands blistered from hot iron. Her eyes burned from nights without sleep. Still she did not stop. She worked with the fierce resolve of a woman who had nothing left to lose and therefore nothing left to fear. She whispered words she no longer trusted, fragments of psalms once spoken beneath candlelight in the convent's cold stone chapel. The phrases sounded empty now, brittle as dead leaves. "He restores my soul," she murmured, though she doubted her soul had ever been restored. Even so, the sound of her own voice steadied her hands. It filled the silence that pressed hardest in the dark hours. The fever clung to Seka. Sweat soaked his skin. His lips moved with murmurs that drifted in and out of sense. More than once Ione leaned close, straining to catch their meaning. But the words were not English. They belonged to another tongue, low urgent. Sometimes they sounded almost like a chant. Once in the thin hours before dawn, his eyes flew open, dark, unfocused, wild with pain. His lips trembled and he whispered a name, not hers, a name she did not recognize. Ione froze her hand, hovering just above his chest. Who was it? A brother? A woman? A child left behind in a burned-out camp? The word meant nothing to her, yet it carried weight heavy with longing and loss. Before she could speak, his eyes slid shut again and he sank back into the fever's haze. Ione sat very still, the name echoing in her thoughts. Her mind drifted to her own past, names she had once whispered in prayer. Ione Whitlock taken too soon. Calder Whitlock. Drunk at the forge. Harlan Drisk, a man who promised land and gave bruises instead. Names that had once held her heart, now turned to dust. For the first time she wondered who this man truly was beneath the blood and scars. What life he had lived before, fate threw him into her path. Later that morning, as she gathered his torn clothing to wash in a bucket of boiled water, her fingers brushed against a small leather pouch tied at his belt. She hesitated. It felt wrong to intrude, yet curiosity tugged at her. Carefully she opened it. Inside lay a bone pendant worn smooth by time. It was carved in the shape of a hawk's eye. The edges were rounded, polished by years of touch. A simple cord looped through it. She held it up to the firelight, studying the fine lines etched by patient hands. A strange feeling stirred in her chest. She had seen ornaments before, crosses hanging from nuns' necks, silver brooches pinned to proud women in Tucson. But this was different. This was older. Untouched by sermons or fashion. This was not decoration. It was meaning. She glanced back toward the cot. Seka's chest rose and fell, shallow but steady. His face was sharp-shaped by hardship, softened now only by weakness. And for the first time, Ione Whitlock felt the pull of a life she did not yet understand, but could no longer ignore. A man her world had branded a savage, yet he carried this mark of vision, of strength. "You're not without a name, Ione," Whitlock whispered, clutching the pendant in her palm. Not anymore. Her eyes rested on the hawk's eye, the bird that could see beyond fear, beyond distance, straight into truth itself. Seka. She spoke it softly, testing the sound. "That's what I'll call you, Seka." The name settled naturally, as if it had been waiting for her voice. She slipped the pendant back into its pouch and tied it gently at his side. From that moment on, whenever she spoke to him, whether he could hear or not, she used that name. When she lifted water to his lips, she murmured, "Drink, Seka." When she shifted his broken leg, or checked the bindings, she whispered, "Stay with me, Seka." When she sat alone by the fire, breathing smoke and shadows, she breathed, "Don't leave me, Seka." Maybe he heard. Maybe he didn't. But speaking the name steadied her as much as the work of her hands. One evening, as the sun sank low and turned the desert beyond the hut into rivers of gold, his eyes opened again. This time they stayed open longer. He watched her lid's heavy body weak, but his gaze was steady. His lips moved, dragging out a word she did not recognize. "I don't understand," she said, gently leaning closer. "But you're alive. That's what matters. She touched his wrist. His pulse was faint, but it was there. And for the first time since she had hauled his shattered body out of the ravine, Ione allowed herself a thin, exhausted smile. Something had shifted. The fever had not broken. The wounds had not healed. But the man she now called Seka was no longer just a body she fought to keep breathing. He was a presence, a life, a soul that refused to surrender. That night, while coyotes cried and the wind scraped dry branches along the walls, Ione did not feel entirely alone. She sat with her back to the fire pistol resting in her lap. She whispered into the dark, "You're Seka, and you're not dying here. Not while I still draw breath." He did not answer, yet she swore she saw the faintest flicker in his eyes, like an ember refusing to go cold. The days that followed blurred together, marked not by sunrise or sunset, but by the constant rhythm of firewood water and quiet words meant to keep a dying man tied to the living world. Ione lived in fragments, the scrape of flint against steel, the hiss of water boiling in a dented kettle, the bitter smell of ash and sweat clinging to the walls. She learned the pattern of his breathing, the way a mother learns her child's every uneven rasp, every sudden silence that sent fear racing through her chest. The fever came in waves. Sometimes his body burned so fiercely she thought he might ignite sweat soaking the straw beneath him. Other times he shook so violently she piled every scrap of cloth she owned over him, praying his bones would hold. Through it all he murmured, words in Apache, low, restless, flowing like water from a stream she could not follow. Sometimes it was a single name, repeated again and again. Sometimes it was a chain of sounds that could have been a prayer or a curse or a memory clawing free from his fevered mind. Ione could not understand the words, but she listened all the same, especially at night when the desert wind howled through the cracks and loneliness pressed against her like a second skin. She answered his murmurs with her own. She reached for the small book of Psalms she carried more from habit than faith. The leather cover was cracked, the pages brittle with neglect. Her voice came rough and worn as she read into the dark. Her voice was untrained, rough from disuse, but it filled the quiet. She no longer read with the fire of belief. Those days had been stripped from her by cold convent walls and sermons that rang hollow. Still the words carried weight. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. She spoke them not for herself, not even for God. She spoke them for the man hovering between life and death beside her. And maybe she admitted to herself for the small, stubborn part of her that still wanted to believe there was something beyond emptiness. On the fourth morning, after 3 nights that felt longer than entire lifetimes, Ione Whitlock woke with her back against the doorframe, her pistol resting in her hand. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, the air faintly scented with pine smoke. For a heartbeat she thought she had imagined it, the soft shift of cloth, the change in breath. Then she opened her eyes. He was watching her, not with the dull haze of fever, not with the wildness of delirium. His gaze was steady, dark eyes, awake, aware, fixed on her. Ione's throat tightened. She set the pistol aside slowly, her pulse pounding with an unfamiliar mix of relief and fear. For the first time he was no longer a body she fought to keep breathing. He was a man, present, conscious, and she had no idea what that meant for her. She rose carefully and stepped closer. His lips parted, dry, cracked, but no sound came. She poured water into a tin cup and lifted it to his mouth. He drank in slow, measured sips, never breaking eye contact. When the cup was empty, Ione set it aside and folded her arms across her chest. Her voice came low but firm. "Listen to me. You're alive because I kept you alive. I don't know who you are or what you've done, but you need to understand this." She held his gaze. "If you try to hurt me, if you even think about it, I'll end you right where you lie." Silence stretched between them. The fire cracked softly. Desert winds sighed against the walls. Inside the hut, there was only the weight of his eyes on her. Then in a voice rough with strain, but steady, he spoke the first words she understood. "You saved me!" Ione blinked. She had expected anger, suspicion, maybe even violence. Not this. Her lips pressed together. "Don't thank me yet," she said quietly. "You're not out of danger. A fever like yours kills men faster than bullets." He didn't argue. He only closed his eyes for a moment, as if even speaking had cost him strength. When he opened them again, they did not drift. They found her face, studied it, and held. Ione turned away, first unsettled by the certainty in his gaze. She moved to the fire, stirring the embers back to life, though her hands shook more than they should have. Something had shifted. He was no longer the helpless body she had dragged from a ravine. No longer just a fevered stranger clinging to breath. He was a man who had looked her in the eye, seen her strength, and spoken the truth aloud. "You saved me." The words stayed with her long after silence returned. She had meant her choice to be temporary, a single act of mercy before leaving him to whatever fate awaited him. But now with those words he had given her something she never expected. A place in his story. And whether she wanted it or not, that story had just begun. In the days that followed, the heat settled into a pattern. Ione Whitlock rose before sunrise to breathe life into the fire, stepped outside to gather kindling, and searched the land for whatever roots or herbs it was willing to offer. By the time she returned, Seka was often awake. Propped against the wall, wounded legs stretched before him, he watched her with those dark, steady eyes. At first they spoke little, a nod when she handed him water, a low sound when she passed him dried meat. Silence stood between them like another wall, yet it no longer felt sharp or threatening. The quiet changed shape, became something else. A truce. Perhaps even a language of its own. Ione found herself talking more, not always expecting answers. She muttered while cooking scalded cinder under her breath, cursed the draft that slipped through the broken roof. Sometimes when the nights grew long and coyotes called across the flats, she spoke of things she had not shared in years. One evening, as she stitched a tear in her coat by firelight, she said quietly, "I was 16 when my mother died." She kept her eyes on the cloth. "My father, Calder Whitlock, was a blacksmith. But he drank more than he worked. The forge went cold. Debts stacked up. I did what I could to feed him." Her voice stayed even, but her fingers paused. "He never thanked me. He died with a bottle in his hand and a curse on his lips." She stared into the flames. "Later I married a man who promised me land, promised me a future. All he gave me were bruises, and nights spent praying for morning." When she spoke again, it was softer. "When he died, I thought I was free. But freedom wasn't waiting. It was just another kind of chain." She fell silent, half wishing she had not spoken at all, until she realized Seka was watching her. He did not interrupt, did not question. He only listened. The following night, it was his turn. His voice was low, rough, broken in places, but the meaning carried through. "I followed my brother Kenu into war. We fought soldiers, settlers, anyone who tried to take what little we had left. One raid went wrong. Too many died. I was shot." He paused. "My people said I was cursed, that bad spirits followed me. They left me in the desert to finish dying." There was no self-pity in his words, only weight. In the dim firelight, Ione saw something deeper in his eyes, a loneliness so sharp it had hollowed him out. She shook her head, firm, despite the ache rising in her chest. "They said you were cursed." "But I don't see a curse," she said. "I see a man still breathing, still choosing to live." Seka held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "And you," he said quietly, "you wanted to die when you found me." The words cut through her like a blade. She turned her face away, ashamed at how easily he had seen her truth. "I thought about it," she whispered. Silence returned, but it was no longer empty. It carried everything they had not said, the shared weight of pain worn in different skins, yet equal in burden. Ione glanced sideways at him, her voice rough. "Would you have let me if I'd stepped off that bluff?" He did not answer at once. Then, steady as stone, he said no. The fire cracked softly, filling the space that followed. Ione drew her knees to her chest and wrapped her arms around them. For the first time in years, she no longer felt completely alone. The days moved forward in that way, quiet, measured, steady. Ione Whitlock tended the fire. Seika worked a small blade against a length of wood, shaping it into a walking stick. She fetched water from the creek. He studied the room as if mapping a world he had once lost. They did not speak much, but when they did, every word carried weight. One morning, she returned from the creek and found him on his feet, unsteady, leaning hard on the stick but upright. Her heart lurched. "You'll tear your leg open," she scolded. He shook his head, sweat shining on his brow. "Not fast," he said. "Just tired of lying down." Ione nearly smiled, though she hid it with a small shake of her head. A stubborn man, stubborn enough to live. That night they sat together in the fire's glow, sharing the last of her beans. Their shoulders did not touch, yet the space between them no longer felt like a gulf. It felt like the start of a bridge. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but sure. "You're not nothing, Seika. You lived through what should have killed you, and so did I. We both came close to the edge, maybe too close." He studied her, then gave a single nod. "Near death," he said, "but not gone." Their eyes met, and in that moment Ione understood the strangest truth of all. She had dragged him back from death's shadow, but in doing so he had pulled her back as well. They were both survivors. Alone they had nearly been lost. Together they had found, if not salvation, then at least a reason to keep going. And for Ione Whitlock, that was more than she had dared hope for in a very long time. The quiet rhythm did not last. It never does in a land where the horizon carries as much danger as promise. One afternoon, Ione spotted a haze of dust rising from the trail beyond the ridge. Not wind-blown, not drifting, steady, purposeful. The mark of a rider. Her chest tightened. Few men rode alone this far south unless they were hunting something or someone. By the time the rider came into view, Seika was already braced against the wall, his knife resting across his lap. His eyes were sharp despite the strain in his body. Ione met his gaze. Without a word, they understood. If this visitor asked the wrong questions, their fragile world could shatter in an instant. The man rode a pale horse. His coat was too fine for desert heat hat brim, pulled low. He dismounted with the easy confidence of someone used to being watched. His boots struck the dirt with a thud that carried more arrogance than greeting. "Afternoon," he called, tipping his hat. His voice was smooth, the kind that hid blades behind a smile. Ione stepped onto the porch, one hand resting near the small pistol at her side. Unseen. "Afternoon," she replied flatly. He studied her with flint-cold eyes. "Name's Bram Holloway. I ride for folks who keep track of movement." He paused. "Heard there was trouble near the Gila. A raiding party went bad. Most didn't make it." His smile thinned. "But word is, one did. Wounded. Apache." Ione's breath caught, though her face did not change. "Don't hear much out here," she said. Bram Holloway's gaze sharpened. "Funny thing," he said. "People whisper he had help. A woman. A lone shack. South Trail," he said. His gaze drifted past her shoulder, as if the very walls might betray her. Ione Whitlock forced herself not to flinch. "Wouldn't be much use lying to you, would it?" "No," he replied quietly, stepping closer. "Not when I can smell 2 fires burning, cooking and heat. That's a lot of flame for one woman." Her hand twitched near the seam of her coat, but her voice stayed even. "Nights are still cold. You're welcome to look for yourself," she added. But you won't find anyone here but me. Silence stretched between them. His eyes searched her face, testing pressing. At last he let out a short chuckle. I like a woman who doesn't scare easy. He tipped his hat again. This time there was no warmth in it. If you notice anything out of place, best pass word along. Bounty laws still hold in this territory. Ione gave a single, tight nod. Sure. He mounted his horse and rode off at an easy pace. But the dust he left behind lingered like a warning. Only when he was gone did Ione release the breath she'd been holding. Inside Seka sat motionless, knife clenched in his lap. He'll come back, she said softly. Seka's jaw tightened. Close enough, he answered. She crossed the room and knelt beside him. If he returns, we move. There's an arroyo trail hard to track. I can't walk far, Seka said quietly. I didn't say you would, she replied, meeting his eyes. For a moment neither spoke. Then his hand reached out and rested on her wrist. Not gripping, not commanding, just steady. Don't run because of me. Ione's throat tightened, but she held his gaze. I won't run, she said. I'll fight if I have to. That night, the weight of what had happened pressed down on them both. Ione sat by the fire, sharpening the edge of her hatchet until it caught the lamplight. The rasp of steel on stone echoed through the hut, steady, relentless. Seka worked slowly at his staff, shaping the wood into something strong enough to lean on if the fight came. Their silence was not empty. It was preparation. It was promise. Later, as the fire burned low, Ione broke the stillness. I could have left you, she said. Her voice held no bitterness, no apology, just the truth. I almost did. Seka lifted his eyes to hers. There was no judgment in them, no anger, only understanding. I know, he said. She swallowed, staring into the embers. But I didn't. For a long while, the only sound was the wind pushing against the shutters. Then Seka spoke again, his voice steady as the land itself. But you stayed. The words settled between them like a vow. Not grand, not poetic, just truth. And sometimes truth is the strongest promise of all. Ione set the hatchet aside, her hands still faintly trembling. She looked at the man who had once been nothing more than a bleeding stranger in the dust. He was still wounded, still hunted, still a danger to every breath she drew. But he was alive because of her. And she was alive in a way she had not been before she found him. So they remained there, together, sitting in the glow of a dying fire, not as rescuer and rescued, not as hunter and hunted, but as two people who had chosen against sense, against fear, to remain. The days that followed carried a different weight, not crushing, not sharp, quieter, softer, like the heaviness that settles after a storm when the ground is still drinking in what fell. The shadow of Bram Holloway lingered somewhere beyond the horizon. Yet inside the battered walls of the hut, something else had begun to take hold. Ione Whitlock felt it in her breathing. Less like a woman braced for the next blow, more like someone allowing air to fill her lungs fully for the first time in years. She had spent so long running from her father's house, from Harlan Drisk's fists, from the convent's cold silence, from herself. Now, sitting across the fire from the man she had pulled back from death's edge, she spoke the truth aloud. I don't want to run anymore. Seka looked at her. His face was still drawn from fever, but sharpened now by awareness. His eyes were steady like a hawk perched above an endless stretch of desert. For a moment he said nothing. Then his voice came low and certain. And I don't want to die. The words hung between them like a fragile bridge, linking one soul worn raw by too much running, and another scarred by too much war. That evening the fire burned low, its glow warm against the rough timbers. Ione sat with her knees pulled close, watching the flames work through the wood. Seka sat across from her, shaping the staff he had been carving. The scrape of blade against grain was slow, even comforting. Something stirred in her chest. Not trust, not desire, but the small, dangerous comfort of ease. Without thinking, Ione shifted closer. Her shoulder brushed his arm barely a touch. For a heartbeat she feared she had gone too far, that he would pull away. He didn't. His body stayed where it was, solid, steady beside her. Then unexpectedly, he let out a low chuckle. Ione turned sharply. "What's funny?" Seka shook his head, the faintest curve touching his mouth. "You scold like a wife. Stronger than the soldiers who left me bleeding. Fiercer than the brother who walked away." He paused. "But you tell me to drink water like I'm a child." For the first time in months, Ione laughed. Not sharp, not bitter, not the kind meant to hide pain. A real laugh, low, startled, spilling out of her, before she could stop it. She covered her mouth, shaking her head. "Lord help me, you're right." Their laughter faded, leaving a silence that was no longer heavy. It was tender, full of something neither named. Ione turned toward him. His face was close now, firelight softening the hard lines of his jaw. His eyes did not waver, and without words, their mouths met. No rush, no urgency, no desperate grasping, just the quiet meeting of two lives that had carried too much loneliness. His lips were warm, gentle, asking, not taking. Her hand found his shoulder steady despite the pounding of her heart. When they parted, Ione did not pull away. She rested her forehead against his, breathing in the closeness, the stillness. For once there was no fear in her body, only the deep relief of finding something that did not hurt. Later that night, Ione reached into her satchel and drew out a small scrap of antler. She had picked it up near the creek weeks earlier, more out of habit than intent. Now she took her knife and began to carve. Slow, careful. She shaped the edges until they curved like a small sunburst, simple, steady. When she finished, she placed it in Seka's palm. "It's nothing," she said quietly. Her fingers lingered there, a moment longer than necessary. She spoke again, a little shy now. "But maybe something to hold on to." Seka turned the antler piece in his palm, his thumb following the careful grooves she had carved. Then he reached to the leather pouch at his belt and drew out the hawk's eye pendant she had once found. He held it toward her. "This belongs to those who see beyond fear," he said. Ione stared at it, breath catching. "Are you sure you earned it?" he answered simply. Her fingers shook as she slipped the cord over her head. The bone rested warm against her skin, as if it had always belonged there. She looked up at him, eyes steady, softened by firelight. "Then I'll keep it." Seka closed his hand around the antler token she had given him. "And I'll carry this." They were not charms of luck, not accidents. They were marks of choice, deliberate, fragile, true. That night Ione lay near the fire, the pendant resting against her chest. Her heart felt quieter than it had in years. She thought of every road she had run, every door she had shut, every prayer she had abandoned. And yet here inside a broken shack, beside a man she had once been taught to fear, she felt a simple truth settle in her bones. She was no longer running. He was no longer dying. And together they had chosen to stay. The quiet did not last. It never does on land claimed by dust and blood. At dawn, the sound of hooves carried on the wind, more than one this time. Ione rose from the fire with her rifle in hand. Seka braced himself against the wall, his staff close. They exchanged no words. They had prepared for this. Bram Holloway returned, but not alone. A soldier rode stiff beside him, and another man carried a rifle across his saddle. Their eyes swept the shack like wolves measuring prey. "Miss Whitlock." Bram called, his voice slick with triumph. "We gave you time. We gave you warning. Now we'll have the truth." Ione stood firm in the doorway. "Step inside," she said evenly, "and you'll leave on your back." The first shot split the morning. Wood exploded as bullets tore through the doorframe. Ione fired back the rifle's kick, rattling her bones, but steady in her grip. Seika moved to the window. Pistol raised, pain flaring through his wounded leg with every breath. Still his hand did not waver. Together they fought, gunfire rolling like thunder through the open desert. One of Bram's men dropped. The soldier scrambled back, swearing. Bram staggered when Seika's shot clipped him low. He clutched his side, fury burning in his eyes. "You'll regret this," he spat, hauling himself into the saddle. "You'll hang for him, both of you." Then he rode off, wounded and furious, carrying not victory, but a warning. When the dust finally settled, Ione and Seika buried the dead without words. Side by side, they patched the holes in the roof. The shack still leaned, still bore scars from the fight, but it stood. And for now, so did they. Morning came gently. Pale light spilled across the desert like a fragile promise. The land remained harsh. The air still cut sharp. The future stretched before them, uncertain as shifting sand. Yet for the first time, Ione did not see only emptiness. She stood in the doorway with a tin cup warming her hands. Beside her, Seika leaned on his staff, steady, despite the scars that pulled at his body. Together they watched the sun climb slow and unyielding over the dust. "Still here," Ione said softly, more to herself than him. Seika turned his eyes, calm and sure. "Still here," he answered. "And not alone." In that simple truth, something settled between them. Not safety, not certainty, but belonging. And so the story closes. What began as mercy became trust, then respect, then love. In a land that demanded everything and gave nothing, freely they found something worth staying for. Not perfection, but presence. Two souls who had nearly been lost, now standing together on a frontier that offered no guarantees. Would you have saved the stranger or walked away? Share your thoughts below. And if this story stirred something in you, please like, share, and subscribe for more tales of the human heart against the wild frontier. All stories are created for entertainment purposes and may include fictional elements or dramatized interpretations inspired by historical settings. We use AI tools, voiceover, visuals, scripts as creative assistants. However, all content is reviewed, refined, and edited by humans to ensure emotional authenticity and storytelling quality. We fully comply with YouTube's policies regarding AI-generated content and do not use any deepfake techniques or misleading recreations of real individuals. All visuals and supporting materials are properly licensed. Sharing, re-uploading, modifying, or distributing any part of this content in any form requires written permission. We appreciate your support and respect for original creative work.